Hello, 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 my friend. Welcome to Person Behind the Pages, the show where we get to know the creators that make the things we love. I'm your host, Nicholas W. Fuller, and I'm joined today by RR Virdi. Hi, Ronnie.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to get to talk to you. We have so much to talk about. You're, of course, a USA Today Bestselling author. You're a Nebula Award finalist, which is a very prestigious award. You're of course, tons of great reviews for your books on Amazon and Goodreads. But you're a former car mechanic, which I think is interesting. I've worked on everything from Toyotas to hot rods. You're a former video game streamer for a little while you're kind of getting established writing, which I think is also fun because I'm a big game nerd. And and today we're also going to talk a little bit about a giveaway. I've got a lovely fan who wanted to help support me, so he's sponsoring a giveaway, and I'll put some info in the chat a little bit later how you can get a chance to win a copy of RR Virdi's book. So check out that. But again, thank you for being here, Ronnie. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, man. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And thank you. Hello, people in chat. I'm here for the smolder. Yep, there we go. There we go. I mean, you do have some captivating eyes, Ronnie. I'm not going to lie.
I can bank on making some money off of them, but thank you.
There you go. Right? Yeah. No, you need to put your author photo on the front of your books. I think that's what. Ryan says howdy. Abel says yo. Thanks for being here, guys. All right. Yes, front of the book. Front of the book. No. All right. So, Ronnie, let's talk first about the first binding. I think that's one of your most popular books. I want to get into it. I'd love to kind of have you explain, that's the book that we're going to be giving away. So who's this book for? Who's the target audience? Who's going to really enjoy this book? What else have they read?
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. What else have they read? That one I might come to last. I need time to think about it. But when I first created it, it definitely comes with being a person of color from the background, but also that's not removed from being a mythology nerd. It's both of those together, because when I was growing up, my mother introduced me to a lot of fairy tales from obviously the Grimms and South Asian ones, because she's from that background, and these are things she collected. It's really a story of her background, because she had a very interesting education, because my grandfather on that side was military. And obviously the influence of the British Raj. So there's a lot of English literature. My mother grew up very well educated, because the military in Asia is treated really well. Like you get really good housing, you get tutors. So she grew up with a lot of classical stories from around the world, speaks multiple languages. And when she immigrated here with my father, she brought some of those books. So from a very early age, I was introduced to mythology, and I grew up with stuff like Aesop's Fables, the Wishbone TV show. And as I grew older and I started consuming more mythology, I started reading a lot of Western fantasy and seeing how many mythological parallels from their inspirations also existed in cultures that don't get talked about. And as I grew older and I had money and time and the ability to screw around in college, I started pursuing a field of what's known as comparative mythology. The idea that a lot of the world's stories come from certain roots that we overlook. We only go back as far as maybe Greek or European, without realizing that a lot of those early cultures come from Proto-Indo-European roots. There was sort of a culture that helped stimulate and kick off some of the cradle civilization myths of the Norse mythology, which has direct parallels to South Asian mythology, which isn't talked about, which has some to Japanese, to Egyptian, to Greek, eventually Roman. And there's a lot of linguistic roots there. And I've talked about this before with the storm god, Deus Peter, who comes from Proto-Indo-European mythology, but that word shows up in South Asian mythology as Skyfather again. It shows up in the Norse. It eventually becomes Romanized to Deus, which is where Deus Vult comes from. It was the original name of Zeus. Zeus is originally Zeus Peter, which was Deus Peter. So Zeus isn't his name, it's actually a title. And the first binding takes sort of this idea of the history of our actual world with epics and mythologies, because you can Google the similarities between the Greek epics and the South Asian. There's certain beats that are the exact same, certain character roles that are the same, mythological references that are the exact same, certain styles of poetic references are the same. And it makes you wonder, are there older stories that even influence them? And so far, the data suggests yes. And then we have the exact same chain in our actual history in fantasy. We know that Robert Jordan was inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. We know Stephen King's Dark Tower has some very interesting parallels at the exact same time as Wheel of Time. They have Arthurian references, references to the Song of Roland, which is a poem. They have the idea of destiny and fate, where in the Wheel of Time, it's the Tavern, and in the Dark Tower, I believe it's the Ka, which is like their wheel of like destiny, fate, and there's people who are chosen by that. I think they're the Ka Tet, and they are children and people chosen by destiny and time. And I wanted to write something that discusses the history of comparative storytelling and mythology. That it's almost like people are telling bits and pieces of the exact same stories around the world because they love them. And how does that refer to a singular proto-hero? So RE is an example of how everyone's cultures and myths, whether it's fiction from our world or mythology from our world, is being looked at in a more Asiatic world with a central figure to sort of explain that. He gets to be the vehicle of everyone has a story about this hero who did something, because we all do in our world. And Ari's just the vehicle for that. He's telling the audience the truth of this is what happened. But weirdly, every country he goes to has some take of his story and has twisted it, because we do that. We all look very similar. Like Beowulf and the story of Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer, are very similar, and they both kill the same dragon, or they both fight the same dragon, Fafnir. I believe Beowulf dies to him and Sigurd kills him. But one's an old English poem and one is a Norse epic. Two different cultures, but where they're inspired by certain similarities. And the first binding is for that. Nerds who want to feel like they've read a fantasy before, but see it through a different lens, see some new things, but also the comfort and familiarity of epics throughout the world, and then actual epics of fiction that we consume.
That sounds so cool. That sounds amazing. I haven't had the same study, but I've sort of had similar thoughts in the very like a base level, but where every different culture has some version of a dragon, it seems like.
Yes,
yes, right.
And specifically a dragon slayer. So if you Google, this is a very simple one for people interested in this, but Thor versus Jormungandr, and you can Google Indra versus Vitra. They're almost the exact same story. Both are sky fathers, who, particularly thunderers. They're warrior gods, and they both kill a serpent tied to water specifically, or a dragon. So both of them also have a similar weapon. Thor is famous for his hammer Mjolnir, which has all the powers of lightning and thunder in it, and it returns to the wielder when thrown. So Indra has something that's called a proto-hammer. It's a war club. And it's an Indian-style war club, so it looks like a small mace. It's bulbous, it's big, it's kind of like Mjolnir, just not as blocky. And it also is said to possess all the powers of a thunderbolt, because he is a storm god. And when he throws it, it also happens to be able to return back to him. Jormungandr is large enough to encompass all the waters of the world. He's like the largest thing in that universe. And Vitra is so large and powerful, he actually kidnaps and holds all the waters of the world hostage in that dragon slaying myth. And both of these guys kill their dragons. But this is also, if you look up, there's the story of Marduk, who is the Babylonian storm god. He kills Tiamat, who is the primordial chaos dragon. So killing dragons is one of the oldest stories that we all have over the world, and it's usually always a storm god too, specifically. They were the gods we worshipped, and that mantle gets passed down. Eventually, it's knights and heroes who have storm-like qualities. You have storm lords, people who want lightning weapons. This shows up even in Dark Souls. I don't know if this is where they got the history from, but that tie of lightning is what kills dragons, because historically throughout our world, it happens. There's a story of Izanami and Izanagi, and then Susanoo, and I forgot what the Japanese dragon is. It might be Orochi. One of them is the 8-tailed dragon serpent, and he's killed by a lightning god.
Wow.
So that story shows up everywhere. And if you think that does, there's a zillion other beats just like that do too.
Right. That is so cool. So what is your theory on kind of the origin of all these similar stories? Is it just so simple as like there's something deep in our psyche that thinks like giant lizards are really cool and we want to, but like they need to be slain? Or do you think that there's some kind of more substantive origin for all this? What's your personal theory?
I think it's actually a mix of all of them, because there is a long history of trade and travel around the world that we forget about. I think, unfortunately, as the internet gets very polarized at times and socio-political, we like to rewrite history and think that everyone was very monolithic and isolated, but we have histories of not just the Silk Road, but trade before that. Like there's a history of Indo-Greek kingdoms. So these two very different cultures at one point there was a kingdom between them that had bits of both. So that means stories are going to be traded because stories are one of the biggest commodity. There's as a book called the Ibn Fadlan by a Middle Eastern traveler, which was the Marco Polo before Marco Polo. And he traveled from the Middle East as far as Russia. And one of the people he brought with him was a professional storyteller who would recount their travels. And this was a form of entertainment. So if you're a trader and you meet with nobles or whatever, you're going to have someone who can like set the mood and entertain. It was a very, I don't want to say prestigious, but it could be a lucrative job. But people are going to incorporate those stories. They're going to take them and retell and twist them. We have a history of how other cultures come up with stories about another place. So there's a story called The Three Princes of Serendip, which is about Sri Lanka or Ceylon or Serendip, which is what it was called in the Middle East. So The Three Princes of Serendip is a story about serendipity. It's just an adventure story. There doesn't need to be a plot to defeat the bad guy, or it's just an adventure. However, while it's about Sri Lanka, it wasn't created there. Another culture created that about them, and it stuck, and it created a different form of storytelling. And now it's traveled the world and it's influenced stuff. Like Zadig by Voltaire was influenced by that story. We have, oh boy, what was it? So the idea of griffins. Griffins exist in South Asian mythology, but not native to South Asia. If you look up the history of griffins, people believe they come from South Asia. It was the Greeks who created the idea of griffins about South Asia. They thought this was a real creature that lived there, along with what's known as the Indus Valley worm, which was this monstrous worm, kind of like the sandworms of Dune, but not in the sand. And they were poisonous, and they could shoot venom and like incinerate and disintegrate people. And it stuck to the idea of the Indus Valley in South Asia, but it was another culture that made this up. And Tales of Tremaine gets into this, how people talk and make up stories about other cultures, and you tell them enough and they stick, how people do it about themselves. And I believe that's just a real part of our actual history of how these happened. We know the Proto-Indo-Europeans were real, and they had certain belief systems and things that show up in multiple cultures. And there's the linguistic evidence with that. There's been some DNA research into that too, specifically about the Y haplogroup, which shows up most prominently now in Mongolians. So we know that there was a migration of them. The theory that gets fought the most was an invasion, and it doesn't seem like it was. It seems like these people just spread, they intermingled, they traded, and they influenced, and then that influence just continued. India and Greece were very close in ancient times. There's history of Greek scholars going to India to study philosophy because they were philosophical friends. They traded. And then the world's first actual residential university where you could go to live and study is Nalanda, which was a South Asian university. And it was prominently because of Buddhism. And we know how far Buddhism spread. It spread all the way to Japan, where Indra, the South Asian storm god, is also still worshipped to this day. He exists there, just more with a Japanese flair and style. But because of Buddhism, you had scholars from China, Korea, Cambodia, Laos, Japan, where Buddhism was come to India, and they would stay there, and you'd have different monks trading information and stories. And storytelling is the oldest, I think, art that we have besides music, which there seems to be strong evidence music existed even before the idea of telling stories in oration and performing. So I just think it's all of that. I think it's love letters. There's history of other cultures going, oh, I like that story, but let's just do our version. I mean, people have just been inspired and taken whatever they've wanted throughout the ages and told their story. I just think it's everything. Yeah.
Bert says, I would just love to spend an hour with Ronnie and learn about all of this. Good news, Bert. That's what we're here for. Ariana says, how can Ronnie remember all this and still have a normal sized head?
If it makes you feel better, I have atrocious memory about other things. Like, genuinely, I will forget conversations with friends 2 days ago because of this stuff. So there's a cost.
There's a cost, right? I feel like everyone has something that they like nerd out about. Like for some people, it's those sports stats, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. There you go. Right, I can't do that. I can't.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to share some details about the giveaway now. I'm going to mention it again later. But I'm going to put into the chat my little form. It's going to be very simple. If you're interested in getting a copy of the first binding, all you're going to need to do is enter your email. That's it. The first 10 people that do the form, I'm going to give you 2 entries. Everyone else is going to get 1 entry. On Friday, I'll randomly select a winner. After you enter the email, you'll have an option to kind of go follow me on some areas, which would be wonderful, and I would appreciate it. If you're here and you're enjoying, give me that subscribe, give me that like. I appreciate that. But that's it. All you have to do is give me your email. If you're the winner, I'll reach out to you to get your address so that we can send you the paperback book. But yeah, get yourself a free copy of the first binding. Who doesn't want that, right?
Thank you.
So this is super interesting. I love what you were talking to about kind of like trade amongst people, and there's evidence too that of course Columbus wasn't the first person to the America. Not only are there
Oh,
probably
right.
Vikings over to North America, but maybe some of the Polynesians came over to Chile.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I've seen like models of very old Chinese ships that are
Right.
gargantuan, which we'd never kind of talk about, but they're like, yeah, at the time that Columbus was sailing with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, which are actually quite small.
Mhm.
Chinese ships were just insanely
Yeah.
huge, and they didn't just, sit in harbor, right?
Oh, no, yeah, there I think, definitely within the last 5 years, and unfortunately, COVID was happening, so people were stressed about other things, but there was stuff coming out about early Chinese, cartographical maps and studies that
Mhm.
implicated that maybe they also did visit the Americas, and
Wow.
I don't know what the final definition or the final conclusion of that was, though, because unfortunately, I too wasn't keeping up with it as much as I should have, but it was definitely very fascinating because intercountry travel has existed forever. Like there was a maritime Silk Road, which people forget, and it was just as big as the land Silk Road. And it changed everything when you bring in oceanics into this. Like the fact that people would go from parts of Africa and through Africa to South Asia and South Asia to China, and then closer ports in there. And it's why in the map of the first binding, there's actually like water routes. And I only bring out port cities because they're just as important to trade and travel.
Right, right. I was talking to Dr. John Morrow last week, and we
Mhm.
were getting into a little bit about interesting. He's the editor and Before We Go blog and Grimdark magazine, one of the editors. But like, we were talking a little bit about how history is so fascinating. As long as you have someone that's like just a little bit passionate and clings on to kind of like a story of it and presents it as a story, there's so much like interesting stuff in
Oh
history,
yeah.
right? But like, and I feel like it's a great place to mine things as
Oh,
fantasy writers
absolutely.
too, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, and it sounds like you did a fair bit of that with the first binding.
Oh,
I'm
a lot. Yeah.
yeah, sounds super fun. But obviously, first binding is not your first work.
Right.
You've written some other stuff. I've been talking with lots of debuts lately, so it's interesting to talk to someone who's not a debut. I definitely want to get
Mhm.
into kind of, and plus you're traditionally published, and I want to ask him questions about that. But
Mhm.
first, like, let's talk about when did you kind of first start writing? Have you always been like had this fascination with stories? Were you writing when you were very, very little, or was there a point where where you were working as a car mechanic and you busted your knuckles on something and you're like, this is for the birds, I'm gonna do something else? How did it go?
So I've always been fascinated with storytelling as an overall medium, not specifically writing. Admittedly, I love consuming stories.
Hmm.
They definitely saved my life. I've talked about this in other places. I had a particularly very rough abusive childhood, and
Mm,
so I did what a lot of people do is I escaped into books because they were cheap, affordable. I grew up very, very like legit dirt poor, so library, but like free books, right?
hmm.
Um, and I never actually thought I would be the writer. In fact, my oldest friend who he 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 doesn't like necessarily he doesn't have like a strong passion in life. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's completely normal for a lot of people. And one day in high school, he actually wrote like because we had to like, what are you going to be when you grow up? Like write it like as an anthropological essay, and it was for an anthropology class. And he's like, I'm going to be a writer, and he just felt that was logical because he was like the biggest bookworm I knew at the time. I chose lawyer because of parental expectations, and I genuinely believed in high school like that's the route I was going to go until we got closer to graduating, and I my depression hit its peak. And I've told this story too, and I tried to take my life that summer, and
Yeah,
it didn't work. And
thankfully.
in the rebound, thank you. In the rebound, I was reading a continuation of a book series by a famous author who I won't name because I do genuinely love their work, but they did something at that time that I wasn't very well too familiar with outside of George R. R. Martin. It's not him. And for a series with as many books as this, they killed off a lot of the primary characters. There was a time skip. It's like everyone's dead now except the main character. And I'm like, you can't do that. That's not what a good writer does. Like you're terrible. And this person's like a 30-time New York Times best-selling author since like the 80s or 90s, right? Like, so what do I know? But it was a very visceral, emotional reaction at a time I was going through it. And I was like, why don't I try to write a book the way I want? And it wasn't like I'll show him. There wasn't any of that. It was just like, well, I had a connection to these characters. I wouldn't do that to characters I care about. Let me try. And I started writing that summer. And it was god awful. Like you could not force someone to read this. It would violate the Geneva Convention. It was bad. But the act of writing actually made me happy. Like something, and I don't have a logical explanation for this. I still don't. But everything genuinely clicked. I felt genuinely happy. even if the story wasn't good, which I knew it wasn't, the idea that, hey, this is something I can practice. I know you can get better at this. This is a craft. Everything seemed to make life sense at that point, and I just started pursuing it, and I never let it go, because my love of storytelling that was tied to that was also originally came from acting. That's, if I had to pursue something, what I thought I would go down. But early attempts at acting got me really good results. But I was told at that time, and this is just where we were as a people, like 2018, that there weren't a lot of South Asian guys who looked like me in Hollywood. And the people who told me this weren't doing it to be mean, and they didn't necessarily hold these attitudes. It was just an awareness of, hey, it's also a business. You might not get the same opportunities. You might not be able to give the same role a chance because of the way you look, because the idea of the Hollywood leading man will be X, Y, and Z, and you don't fit that. And it wasn't personal. They were being very blunt. And I did internalize that. And I was like, they have a point, right? At this point, 2018, or 2008, wow, 18, my time is off. 2008, when I was 18, I'm old. It was Carl Penn, who had done, I think at this point he was a doctor on House, and then he was a comedic relief in Harold and Kumar. And then it was Kunal Nayar, again, comedic relief. And that's what I was told. It was like, you're either going to be comedic relief, you're going to be doctor or a terrorist. And I was like, all right, yeah, I can't, there probably isn't much room for me to pursue acting at this time. And it eventually all came back around through storytelling in a different format. And the first binding, where Ari is a performer who never got to be one in his childhood, at least. Like, he grows up in a stage of theater people, and he, of course, doesn't get to be one, which I didn't. There were certain structural reasons I did that. And we can get into the psychology of writing later for that. But that probably was also subconsciously me putting my theater realizations into that. And I didn't realize it at the specific time.
Wow. Journey.
Yeah.
That's, well, first of all, glad you failed.
Thank you.
But yeah, and that's super cool that you found writing as this outlet that like sustained you in that way. How did you thought you were going to be a lawyer, you were into acting, but somehow you got into working on cars? How did that evolve?
Yeah. That's interesting. And I think that's a lot of psychological programming that I wasn't aware of then, but therapy and being an adult now, yay. So my dad was specifically a cab driver in the 90s for the longest time. And if you come from a blue collar background, which a lot of people I'm sure who watch this do, and they understand, there's a lot, especially when tied to poverty, of fixing it yourself. So my dad's car was his livelihood, and he was putting so many miles in a week. I learned very quickly it was normal for cab drivers to do like weekly oil changes, weekly maintenance, because it's just the sheer wear and tear of 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Like, you're putting more miles in just a month than most people do in a year sometimes. So he would start doing basic repairs at home if he could save the money, like brake jobs and whatever. And he'd have mechanic friends who service cabs, and he'd learn from them. And I started learning from him because he'd be doing them in the lot, like just a basic bottle jack or whatever, jacking up a car and just doing a brake job. And every kid has the joke, right? Like being the kid where your dad's like, hand me the screwdriver, but there's 4 types. And he's like, hand me one of them. And you're like, which one? He's like, the screwdriver. It's like, and you're an adult, you're like, bro, there's 4. There's a Phillips, there's a flathead, whatever. And but it was one of the earliest bonding things that I did have with him, even though it wasn't always a great experience. And as I grew older, I just think other stuff with cars just started culturing me. I started falling in love with them. I started seeing cool stuff. Like when I did go with my dad to DC, I'd go for ride-alongs. He'd stop at like little mechanic shops that service cabs. They'd also be installing sound systems in the 90s, back when everyone had like the big subwoofer, like they just took up part of their huge trunk. And I started seeing like the early, for me, movement of customizing cars. Like and DC was a specific look. The 80s and 90s cars were obviously popular. There was a lot of like classic Impalas and Chevelles, older El Caminos, and they would get the big rims and lowered and bagged and like the candy paint. It was a certain kind of look. It wasn't high performance necessarily, but it opened my mind to how customizable cars were.
Yep.
And then Transformers had a rerun in the 2000s, and as a kid, that was just very cool. I loved anime and getting into it. So there was a lot of car anime and consuming that. And by the time I got older, it's every little thing I think just started connecting me to the car world. Like I grew up, and my parents live in a specific community that was built for Korean War veterans. It's all pop-up homes that popped up during that era. Very similar, like 2 to 3 bedroom, 1 or 2 bathroom, small single story, very
Yep.
small homes, like what the American dream was supposed to be, the white picket fence, tight quarter-acre lot. They all look the same. But because of that, there were a lot of Korean War veterans in my neighborhood when I grew up. So I would see guys who probably blew their first check and their bonuses on muscle cars. Like the guy across the street from me was a Korean War vet, and he had an old Cutlass 442, right? With the 2 racing stripes. It was cherry red, 2 white stripes. Beautiful car. He let me look at it, take kids for a drive if he could. People a few blocks down had an old GTO. So I grew up around a lot of classical muscle too. And by the time I turned 16, it was just normal. I was working on cars for fun, friends' cars. And then in high school, not the smartest choice I made, because this is when the first gas crisis for my generation happened, where gas hit $5. I bought a 97 Trans Am, the V8 LT1 out of the Corvette in it, and we supercharged it. So I got like 8 miles per gallon while driving to high school. So that's all I drove it to. I drove it like the 5 minutes to high school and back, because that thing pissed gas. And that eventually just cemented it for me. When I became a writer, I needed some form of stable income, and cars seemed like the way. I did. The longest time I spent in college was in pursuit of automotive, making sure by age 19 I had a state emissions and safety inspection license, and I was going for pursuits in the ASC, the Automotive Service of Engineers certifications for you have the A1 through A8, and then L1 in Advanced Engines Performance. And I was hardcore doing that at 18, 19, just going into cars. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I have a somewhat similar, like what my when I moved to Florida when I was 16, my father's job got transferred, but we brought a lot of stuff over, including 2 vehicles, but I was just getting my license. Like just before we moved, my dad says, okay, you're here. You're like, I know you didn't want to come, but $5,000, you can get any car you want. It's your car. And I was like, okay, like started going through like Auto Trader, like, ooh, I see this 1977 MGB. You ever seen, you know, the MG?
Ooh.
right.
One of the most reliable cars you could get.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I knew that it was going to need work and whatnot, but I was like, Dad, we can do this together. It'll be like, experience.
Oh, that's wholesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a nice idea. It was, I mean, we like, what did that, but that car was fun. Like all 2 times I got to drive it to school, like you said. So like not reliable, but
God, I've got stories about those.
Oh, really? You worked on some MGs?
I worked on a lot, and my friend, actually one of my friends from college, that very automotive classes we took, is now the manager for one of the best, specifically European and specifically British in that car shops in the country, London Auto Services, which is like 5-10 minutes from my house. And I remember it was at college, he bought an Alfa Romeo Spider, and I was like, why would you do this? Like, it is one of the most prettiest cars. I'm like, the amount of times that thing's going to work. And every other day, I'm like, how's the Alpha? And he's like, yeah, it's got a problem. I'm like, yeah, I bet it does. And he recently bought a Jaguar. I love this guy to death. I'm like, why did you buy a 2000s Jag? He's like, 'cause it's Jag. And I'm like, right, but how well does it run? He's like, I learned my lesson. I'm like, and what's that? And he said, I have twice what I paid for it saved up for repairs.
I'm not sure if that's like the takeaway that you're supposed to have, but like, good for him.
If you want a British car from a certain period, unfortunately it is.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, no, I've learned the lesson, and I probably won't get another car like that. But but it was fun at the time.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
So, all right. So you were a mechanic. You were turning wrenches. You were doing that to kind of pay the bills while you were kind of establishing as a writing career. Now you're a full-time writer, right?
Right. Yeah.
I'm curious because you kind of were hinting at this about like how like blue collar mindset. There's this mindset of like fix it yourself. I think there's often a lot like in the blue collar, work. There's a lot of pride in the work that they're doing and the fact that they're doing work with their hands and that sort of thing. And now you're making stuff up and putting it on paper, right? So what is this like? How has that sort of changed your like self identity? Has that been like a bit of a process? Have you just transitioned or like has? No. Go ahead.
I actually think of writing as very blue collar work if you look at it that way intentionally. Because there's different kinds of writers, and this is not going to be a criticism, but I understand like we're in a time period where nuance is hard on social media, so I just would rather clarify that. Because you have like Stephen King, right? He treats it very workmanlike. He puts it's a job every day. You show up and you do the work, but I understand that's not always viable. Everybody's built different. Mental health, I suffer from issues too. And it'd be the equivalent of being a plumber, right? Like if you break your hand as a plumber, which is one of the most blue collar trades I can think of, you can't do certain stuff.
Right.
But no one thinks about that with writing. If your mental health is like damaged, your mental health is what you work with. But there are
Yeah.
other aspects you could treat like a blue collar job. You show up every day, you put in the time and the hours, and you can be very consistent because there are entire writers who have built careers that way. Jim Butcher, obviously, my mentor and my hero, is one of those authors where for a time he was doing 2 books a year. He had Dresden and Codex of Valera, and it was you show up every day, you write one, you get the word count done, you send it out for its process, at least in traditional where it's being edited. While that's going on, your editors are looking at it, you start the next book and you rotate back and forth. And I've been doing that where I usually do about 2,000 words safely a day. And on bigger projects, I'll do 4 to 6K, or I'll compartmentalize and I'll do multiple different projects a little bit each day. And I try to get to the same overarching amount of words. And I try to treat this like a job. And I think for me, that works and it helps. Everybody's different and they have to write for a way that works for them. But me treating it like it's blue collar has helped. And all of my inspirations are very blue collar authors. If we go back into the literature, the history of the literature of a lot of the SFF, you can find for modern stuff, it comes back from more mainstream genres of a past era. So for urban fantasy, which I love, it obviously has roots in the noir detective genre, which if you go back far enough, it's Raymond Chandler with Philip Marlowe. And he was writing like serialized works. This was a job back when writers were paid by the word a lot of time. He had to sit down by typewriter and put books out or put words out in chapters. It was a job, job by the hour or by the word count. And they led to the fundamentals of other genres spinning out of them, because urban fantasy is the noir detective meets the fantastical and supernatural. And cyberpunk is the exact same thing, with a lot of the social issues of critiquing government or problems in the individual, but in a sci-fi noir environment. So a lot of the early pulps, like Robert E. Howard, who contributed so much to fantasy through Sword and Sorcery. Again, he treated this like a job. He had serialized work. He was a fiction guy. He was doing it. Robert Jordan, who was extremely prolific, even wrote a Conan story. His work ethic clearly shows a guy who was putting out, I don't know what the early Wheel of Time books were, 280, close enough to 300,000, and then a little bit bigger. But he was doing them one a year for a while, which is impressive.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize he was doing that much. That's crazy. Also, yeah, I had just found out that Robert Jordan, he wrote one Conan book. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's that's wild.
Yeah.
It just seems, I mean, obviously they're both fantasy, but it seems like a lot of differences. But that's cool.
So Warriors of Altai, was it Altai or Atlai? I can't pronounce it. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it was the proto Wheel of Time, was kind of a nod to a lot of his Conan roots. If you go in and look into it, there's a lot of sword and sorcery in his blood and what he loved. And that didn't turn out. I can't speak to what it is now and the version that was released posthumously. But at the time, I don't know the whole story, but I knew that there was enough of it that he wanted to take the Wheel of Time and what would eventually become that a different route than what he wrote there. But that's still a very, very good story. It's very Robert Jordan. It's just different.
Love that. Yeah, it's so interesting. I love that you're talking about too, kind of the workman-like and just like sitting down and doing the work. I mentioned that I'm a member of this little group of debut authors called The Break-In. There's one guy that's like, he's just released his second book and he's going to have his third book in June. And I'm like, bro, how do you do it? You know, like, he's like, well, you know, it helps that I've like already committed to making this my full-time job. I had some savings and I'm like full-time. So kudos to him. But he's like, the only other thing he really said is that he spends like 3 hours a day committed to writing, Monday through Friday, 3 hours a day. I'm like, I feel like it's so stupid, but it feels like kind of a light bulb moment for me, because I feel like, you know, you got to prioritize it. You got to make you got to spend the time doing the thing, right? Like, so that's really interesting that you're kind of, the same thing. What else, like, what are some of the things that are, you know, let's talk craft just a little bit, like what works for you in as your process. Also, one of the things that I'm really interested in too, it seems like there's tons of advice for drafting, I feel, but a lot less advice for editing. So what is your like editing process like, and how many rounds do you do before you send it to your editor at your publishing house?
It definitely depends on genre and style. So for urban fantasy, which is so rooted in mine, particularly in the detective genre, I don't have to do structural edits really much at all, because I'm a pantser, but it's not like I don't know where I'm going, because I do, like you've seen with my history of literature, I study craft religiously. It's the one thing Jim Butcher definitely imparted on me, is to be a craft monkey. And I'm always experimenting, which is where Tales of Shemaine come, with new structures, new formats to get better at them. Because if you ever do anything simpler, it's easier to reduce that. So my mystery series are very, very easy for me to write. I don't have to do much structural edits. I'll do developmental for maybe I repeated a theme too much, or I repeated certain saying or paragraph, and I can trim it and tighten it up in lines, and then it goes out. With Tales of Tremaine, it's a lot harder because it's a much deeper series in that so many lines have meanings. It's written to a certain lyrical cadence because I worked with foreign and English speaking voice coaches for years while writing the first one to make sure that it mimicked the sound of an oral performer trying to create oral pleasure, that even just the sound and the pacing of the words sounds beautiful, because that was actually part of legitimate old school storytelling. If you're the kind of storyteller that Ari is, his story has to be performed that way by the sheer dint of his nature and his job, right? He's not someone who's just there to perform for a king's court. He's performing for audiences all over. That is the performance. It's the live acting, YouTube, whatever sensational entertainment you want of that era. So I have to balance that, meaning if there's certain cuts, I have to make sure everything still reads to that same flow psychologically, and when you hear it in your inner narrator. And then there's certain structural beats because I'm not using the same kind of structure as everybody. It's frame narrative. I'm not writing a 3-act. You defeat the bad guy in one book. It draws from a nature of fiction that comes out of Europe called the picaresque, which comes from the Spanish picadillo, which means to kind of wander and gallivant. So Don Quixote is a picaresque. It's the wandering story, but it also draws from the epics, which are just great adventure stories. Like the Odyssey is really just about a guy getting home, but it's the adventures he has along the way, which are like little vignettes and slices of life. And they're very epic and grandiose and mythic, but they are also reduced down to a certain human level of father trying to get back for his wife, father trying to get back for his son, mortal temptations, trying to be a good captain for his crew. But it's a Greek story, so he's capricious. He has human flaws. Like he tempts things, like he mocks the Cyclops, child of Poseidon, which he shouldn't do. And he's old and wise enough as a battle-tested commander to know this, but he still does it. So human foibles. And so Tremaine demands a lot more in editing to make sure I pay off all these different promises and structural things I'm doing, because I've got 2 timelines. But then I have nesting stories in there, which are telling stories of their own, and they are integral to the nature and promise of the story as well as the actual plot. Even if people don't realize that, there's a secondary POV that's very minimal, and there's intentional reasons why it's done that way. I have tonal shifts and changes. So most of the story is in first person past. Eloines are in third person present, from a POV that may not be her own. It's structured clearly as like a stage narrator narrating her, which is in a book all about stories and plays. That's a different voice I have to get right. And then Ari has moments in the past narrative where it goes first person present, which many people would tell you in fiction is a no-no, switching tenses, but it's done very rare enough, and finding the balance of when is that allowed to, in this case, up the dramatic presence and impact of a scene. When can you get away with that? So there's a lot of experimentation, and that's where I have to do a lot more editing work to make sure it pays off, specifically with that series. But I do genuinely believe the adage of editing is where the magic happens, because it's where you can tidy up all your plot holes and make everything look like it was perfectly planned, whether you're an outliner or pantser. Because we've all seen Twitter threads where outliners have to still rewrite books. They realize like, oh, I put this plot point in, and if I go back and change this, now it looks perfectly planned. And it's the same with pantsing.
All right.
I think that part's just the process of what do you enjoy more to finish a story? What lets you be consistent? I don't think one's better than the other. It's just what lets you be more consistent and enjoy writing.
I agree. I love what Neil Gaiman said. Like someone asked him like how different is his final draft than like his first draft, and he's like, they're the same except for in every way that matters. Right? And he said like the first one's just kind of throwing stuff on the wall, and then after you sort of see the shape that it has, and then like everything else is making it seem like you had the intention to begin with, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like sculpting. If you look at like the history of sculpting, which is fascinating, it's everyone starts with the rudimentary form, and over time you keep adding details. You're doing less, I don't want to say less work, that's not true. You're doing more finite, controlled, specializing work after you get the lump in shape enough to the rough of what you want. And that's where you make it shine.
Right. Yeah, not less work, but less like changes and more detailed changes, right? But it makes a big difference. Interesting. All right. I want to again mention we're doing a giveaway. You can get a free copy of the first binding, sponsored by an anonymous fan. Thank you again, anonymous fan. But yeah, they just wanted to kind of see my channel succeed. So what we're doing is I just got a form I put in the chat again. Just going to collect your email. The first 10 participants are going to get 2 entries, and I'll randomly select a winner on Friday. Yep. Everyone else will get like 1 entry after the first 10. But yeah. Randomly select a winner on Friday, and if you're the winner, I'll email you and I'll ask for your address so we can send you a paperback copy. So sign up for that. Also, give me that like and subscribe. I appreciate it. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about writing, a little bit about craft. We talked about kind of you were a mechanic and you got into writing right after. It sounds like, I mean, you were a mechanic pretty young, and yet you've also done quite a few other jobs. I always think it's sort of interesting to kind of just get the list from creatives, because like in my, there's the exception to the rule, like the Brandon Sanderson, who like he was pretty much writing from the womb. not quite, but like in college he was writing, and he's launched his career pretty early on. But most of the writers I talk to have had a little bit of a meandering path to being a full-time writer. So tell me some of the like other jobs you have. I guess you worked in the restaurant industry for a while too.
Yeah, definitely bouncing around food, which mostly came from social relationships and dating, because I've always had a fascination with food. I love it. It shows up in the first binding, and there's a lot of fascinating documentaries now coming out about how food has also influenced the world. Traded stories and immigration and migration food has changed so much. Like so much of Southern American cuisine comes from Haitian Creole and a lot of Africans who were obviously brought over, and they were doing the cooking for affluent white families a lot. So a lot of their roots are in Southern food. And the same thing happened throughout lots of parts of the East, because there was an Indian migrant and also slave labor trade too, where Indians were brought under British colonies to other places to influence with food. And as I learned the history of that, I thought food was a magical, beautiful vehicle. And then I'm also a foodie. So if I was ever in a relationship with somebody and I found out they loved a certain food, and I needed a job, it's like, oh, I could go work in a restaurant that learns to make that, and then I could also learn to make someone's favorite dish. And that's something, despite how relationships have gone in the past or whatever, that the passion for that has still endured. And food industry jobs are also very just always in need of people. So there's the whole joke with actors, right? You can work as a line cook or you can work as a waiter in Hollywood while you're making ends meet, because it lets you survive but have the flexibility to do stuff. Food industry jobs are very much still like that for writers or any other art. They're demanding, but they're always open. You can make something, and if you happen to like food, it's tolerable. I'm not going to say it's always enjoyable or easy, because you're not making food for you.
Right. Yeah, I worked at a Chinese takeout place for a while. That's my only like restaurant experience. But I did delivery driving for a while, which is fun. I actually really enjoyed that because I could just kind of do my own thing and listen to my music and be like crazy food.
Right.
But I also kind of worked as like a fry cook for a while, which like on a Friday night, was right. Like it's so busy, you get so slammed. I have vivid memories of like the orders would come in, and like because it's I think kitchen environments are always this like sort of weird and like low key informal environment. So like orders would come and I'd be like, oh, fuck, like, oh shit, like, and like the Chinese dudes working were just kind of like laughing, and I was like hamming it up more and more. And then the woman at the front was like, you can't do that. They hear you. You just need to stop,
Yeah.
It was good times.
Absolutely.
Only left it because I like to joke that China Garden doesn't have a lot of upward mobility,
Yeah, there's a lot of that in a lot of the smaller food industry places. It sucks, and the toll on your body is very similar to mechanic. Like just the amount of times you're going to get burned to get used to getting burned,
Sure,
or cut. Yeah.
How ripped up did your knuckles get turning wrenches?
Oh god, wrenches a lot, even with gloves. The biggest thing though was being that young was my back, because I've always been really flexible and in shape and worked out. The toll on my back at such a young age. Thankfully, I have no issues. I got out early enough from heavy like dealership level mechanic work where you do it, but like the confines you have to get into. Like the first time I was working on the engine of a Toyota Previa, I didn't know it was underneath the driver's seat. Is how you get to it. The driver's seat slowly back and it folds folds backwards, and the engine bay is right there, and squeezing into that was tight. Or I worked at Toyota specifically. I'm not gonna say which dealership, which was a great dealership, but I don't know if like there'll be ramifications for this. But it was during when Toyota was having the unattended acceleration recalls. Like they were saying like, oh, Priuses aren't braking on the highway and they're just going to 70 and 80. And we were doing the PCM, the powertrain control module reflashes for the computers, and we were pulling out brake pedals and shaving them down, because part of that was also that customers were getting them stuck under having 3 freaking weather mats instead of having one like you're supposed to. So there was some customer error during that time. But getting into those tight spaces sometimes was absolutely gnarly. Like you'd have to be built like a twig. And you do that every day for hours and hours on a day. I was looking at mechanics who were like in their 40s when I was just 20. They look like they were 60 or 70 because you're breathing in sometimes very dangerous materials, sometimes carcinogens, brake dust, which is not healthy for you. The amount of guys I knew who were old mechanics who had certain eye problems because you would get old rust and stuff falling into your eyes, even if you wear goggles. Sometimes if you're not wearing the ones that absolutely stick to your face, just safety goggles, they'll fall in. And there's a procedure I didn't know about until I was a mechanic of getting shrapnel and metal like scraped out of your cornea, which is not a pleasant experience. I haven't had it, but I've seen there's a lot of health effects of just being a mechanic that adds up every day. Swollen fingers, illnesses. It's just not good. And I saw that at an early age. And I'm like, I'll get out of like the line mechanic. Like I didn't work at Jiffy Lube, but that style of very high end, many hours doing basic repair jobs and complicated ones on their timetable. So maybe moving more towards custom cars and a little bit of freedom, which is what prompted that change.
Yeah. Makes sense. Wow. Yeah, my brother's been a mechanic for a long time, and like some of it's not fun. Some of it's not bad, you know?
No, but, you can make a lot of money. They pay very interestingly for people who don't know, and you could also use this in a fantasy because models of this have existed where it's a flat rate. So you get paid for doing the job based, it's almost like gambling, based on what dealerships or the engineers or whatever decide this job should take in times of hours. Now, it's never ideal because you're working in a tight situation. Like an oil change pay is 15 minutes. It's a quarter of an hour. When's the last time you've got an oil change done in 15 minutes at any dealership? It's not happening. Parts department, getting your car, finding the car in the lot, getting everything, making sure the bay's open, taking it off, jacking it. It's not going to happen, but it pays that. So mechanics lose money doing that, but it's the only way to work up. But warranty work can sometimes says like, oh, this will take 3 hours to do. And if you're a competent mechanic, some of those will take an hour and a half. Some of those will take an hour, but you get paid that full 3 hours. Right. So specifically during the Toyota recalls, I think they were paying 2 hours, 2.3 hours to do the recall. I was doing them in 45 minutes. I'm not sure if I could say that, but the work got done. The work got done. Like they had a structure for like how you needed to shave the brake pedal down, and people were like sawing them and cutting them and sanding them. And I and some other friends took old brake shims, which are very soft pieces of metal, and I'd fold them into the shape that you could slip onto the brake pedal at the exact dimensions, and then you just take a piece of chalk and you just draw off the marks, and then you just tap it to a grinder. So it's like bzz, 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 3 seconds, shave down, file it, brake pedal's done. While that's going on, you have a computer hooked up, reflashing the PCM. Worst case, 45 minutes, and I'm getting paid 2.3 hours. And the work is 100% done, verified. It's meeting all qualities. It's just wait, and mechanics would trade these tricks because when you get used to stuff, that there's old master techs who are like, oh, I know how to do this job like in 30 minutes. It doesn't take 3 hours. You just need these tools, and this is how you do it. And they teach, and you could get better at it. But yeah, that's like the upside. You can make a lot of money if you know what you're doing, but it takes a lot of investment of time, being curious, pain. Financial pain because you have to invest in a lot of tools. Like every serious mechanic I know is up to their eyes in debt to a Snap-on or Matco tool salesman.
That's really interesting though when you're doing the same job and you find those tricks and like you're doing the long job in a short amount of time, but it helps when you're doing the same job repeatedly and you're able to find the tricks.
And those tricks show up in fantasy. There have been fantasy novels that talk about class and poverty and having to work as a living, where the people you work for also like own your tools, or they rent them back to you, and they rent you your cot. They rent you. I'm a huge literature history buff of like reading everything and knowing what books take from what books and inspiration. So this is specifically done actually in the Darth Bane books, the Star Wars books that follow him, where there's the past of Darth Bane is he lives in a mining town. And this is not unheard of, and this has happened in real history, where you're essentially kind of a slave labor miner. Your debts are owned by the corporation. If you gamble or try to have any peace or drink anything, it comes out of the corporation money, which then they can interest and tax you. And your mining equipment is rented from them, and so on and so forth. It just creates this horrible situation of like you're always in debt and you're trying to work out of it, but the corporation you work for owns all your debt and everything you can use to get out of it. And we see models of that in real life. Yep. Especially, historically. Hopefully less of that now, but it still occurs. Well, I'm glad that you kind of taken it back to the books. That's where I wanted to get back to also. One more kind of job related thing though, briefly.
as you're kind of getting established as a writer, you also were doing video game streaming. What game were you streaming? I must know.
So I was actually doing variety, and I admit I
Okay.
wasn't good at streaming in terms of understanding the business of it. I wasn't aware that and this is not a slight. It's just when I came into it, I was doing it only for fun, which is
Yeah.
what you should be doing these things for. But I still would like to have succeeded. And I didn't realize that people chose specific games at the time specifically to build an audience for the game and build like a reputation of I am an X game streamer. And I was
Mhm.
doing everything because I came in from this is fun. I used to
Mhm.
game a lot as a kid. I used to compete and stuff for Halo and things like that. Never at the
Okay.
very top, but I was pursuing it and I was damn good. Um, and I was breaking down story stuff because I'd already started writing. So I would do like Dark Souls 1 and break down like, oh, this myth or this character is actually inspired by some of these things, and here's where you do it. And then like a week later, I'd be doing Sekiro, or I'd be doing um, a first-person shooter, and I didn't keep the consistency of the game to build the brand. But it was fun because like I was doing well at times and then I wasn't because of that. Like some days I would actually have like someone was really nice and like well off and they'd give like $200. I'm like, wow, that's someone's like
Woo.
income for a whole day. And then it'd be like a week
Yeah.
of absolutely nothing because I'm not playing the game that person liked. And I never made that correlation. I was just bouncing around having fun.
Yeah. Streaming is tough. I played around it with just a little bit, but like it's interesting too how different it feels to play a game while you're on stream than just playing it totally for fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you have to be like on, you have to be talking the whole time.
Yes.
You know, you're trying to be entertaining while you're
Yes.
playing a game. Yeah, very different.
The
But
best advice I got is it can be similar in being a writing panelist in that it's not about you at that point. You can be mediocre as a gamer in terms of like skill, but what matters is the audience and fan interaction. If you are fantastic at that and you care and you interact, you have the potential to do really well at streaming. Nobody cares if
right.
you're good or not. You're there to interact. You're really an entertainer.
Yeah. You're yeah. Well said. Okay, so you do playing around with that for a while, but you haven't had to succeed with that because your writing career has taken off. So that's fantastic. You book. You're uh, traditionally published author also, which is neat. I don't get to talk to too many traditionally published. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, you were, I think you mentioned at one point to me somewhere else about kind of the influence of the traditional publishing and like the sort of the drive towards the romantasy dollar right now. How are you feeling as a traditionally published author in terms of, do you get pressure to sort of write a certain kind of story right now, or
That's
how?
interesting. So I will say it's come up in the industry. Editors have suggested it to me, not necessarily my editor at Tor, but you go to conventions, you meet people. There's definitely the subtle pressure of, hey, we're not, or I should say, one publishing house, and I don't want to say it because I'm not trying to get into the issue of that. But I understand it's a business motivated decision. But they said something along the lines of, we're not really looking for a lot more traditional mainstream SFF. They wanted more cozy, romantasy, or more. I guess larger mainstream fantasy, like contemporary, maybe something along the lines of what Neil Gaiman would want. And of course, this is like right now. If someone's listening to this as advice, I'm not saying this as advice because please know, let's say by the time you have a book ready, the industry can change again. That's very dangerous advice to chase those trends.
Right.
Traditional does chase trends as much as it says it doesn't like to. It absolutely does. It's the easiest way where the money is because the history of romance and thrillers have been that they've established and continue to set trends. It's definitely been positive to me. It's smart if I could write a romantasy and other stuff. Other podcasts that focus on publishing news have talked about and taken anecdotes that SFF right now isn't seeing an investiture of a lot of money for new authors. Debuts. It's kind of been shrinking even since I debuted. I have to admit because this comes into the industry and people need to admit and talk about it, that luck is a proponent. And I came in just before the wave of this. And I've been fortunate that the first binding did it really well, where it out-earned most of its advance, if not all of it, depending on how you want to break down the royalties within the first 4 months. So my IP and maybe hopefully my future in continuing at SFF is just a little bit more stable.
Right.
But no one really knows, right? Like my book 2 hasn't come out yet. It's coming out this fall. We have to wait to see how that does. I'm confident. but yeah, the pressure has been there in terms of other people and what they're buying. Agents have certainly been suggesting it. Authors behind the scenes are talking about it, and I understand because it's a business, and for many it's their livelihood. And realities happen. This isn't new. There was a period where I can't remember if it's the 70s or 80s. SFF became ghettoized, where you have old legends like Robert Silverberg, who was inducted into the Hall of Fame or a Grand Master for Science Fiction Writers of America. He talks about where he wrote romance and other articles and things for a while to make ends meet because SFF just wasn't paying. People weren't buying it. They weren't supporting it. And unfortunately, it's happened a lot to genres. Like there was a period where sci-fi was not as prominent. Fantasy was. And then like the 90s, it was all super fantasy, sword and sorcery, you know, like obviously Drizzt, Forgotten Realms was killing it. And a lot of SF that was blowing up was actually specifically IP work. It was Star Wars and Star Trek books. Star Wars was dominating the 90s. Like if you wrote a Star Wars book, you could make really good money back then. Like, and it became a living for a lot of authors, like a very good living. Even into the early 2000s, while there was definitely niche and hit sci-fi books, if you think of mainstream, especially for me coming from a poor background, a lot of the mainstream books I saw were IP books, like the Halo novels, the Gears of War novels. Like I remember Karen Travis, and a lot of names that were pushed to me weren't necessarily ones who were winning awards. Maybe that the zeitgeist of publishing was talking about, but mainstream readership was looking at video game SFF novels. And I'm not saying there weren't great works. Of course they were, but what goes mainstream isn't necessarily the exact same of what core niche audiences remember. Like fantasy in the 2000s was bigger than I remember for individuals. Like I remember Peter V. Brett blowing up. I remember Brent Weeks, obviously Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, because they had the Robert Jordan quote. And unfortunately, it's something that just suffers. Being that I started self-publishing with urban fantasy as my favorite genre, it was partially because no one was publishing it anymore traditionally when I started. The industry had already seen its big names come up, and it was supporting them. And now it feels like it's even more dead. That's just my favorite genre.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how, you know, it can feel dead, but then you have it seems like the I don't know if you've paid attention to lit RPG and progression fantasy.
I actually wrote 2 of those, yeah.
Oh, okay, my bad.
No, you're totally. I don't expect people to know it, yeah, but yeah, I wrote 2.
Yeah, but you know, guys like Shirtaloon or Will White are just selling tons of books on Amazon now.
And that's interesting if you look at the history, because I know I'm very fortunate to know some of the people who debuted with it in America. I don't want to say originated it because the genre history that's very fascinating. It goes back. You could pull back to anime specifically from the 90s, or you can argue there's a seminal work that's Korean, a manhwa called Legend of the Moonlight Sculptor that kicked off Russian fans being interested in it, and then Americans. But some of the names who were the original blow-ups, they don't get talked about as much anymore because of now there's a whole movement of web serial writers like Shirtaloon, Pirate Abba, and they're changing the game too in other interesting, beautiful ways where they're bringing serialized structure in those formats of stories in the web serial format to the forefront. So the evolution of the genre has also been very interesting. It's changed who and what and the dynamics, because lit RPG started with what's known as stat heavy, where you break down everything. And then there was a counter movement of stat light where people wanted the escapism and the fun, but not all the stats. And then you had dungeon core, which blew up. And then you have other sub niches of that constantly evolving. And I wrote closer to the stat heavier side when I wrote 2 books in the series, and I was fortunate they did well, but I actually wrote something that at the time wasn't popular, and I went closer to very grimdark, and it wasn't as fun escapey, and it was talking about child deaths and mortality rates and societal overpopulation issues, and then solving that through a video game.
I wonder how that would do now. How long ago did you write that?
So Goblin King came out 2017 or 18, and the Beast Queen came out 2019. And I can do more books. I have the 3rd cover. I just stopped because at the time I was also writing Tales of Tremaine, and then that went a completely different route than I thought. Because originally it was going to be Audible, and it was going to be a serialized picaresque. And then Tor hopped in and saying, "We want this," and that changed everything. So yeah, it's a good question. I have no idea if the readership today would be interested in me continuing a very grimdark lit RPG that's on the stat heavier side. I can't actually say.
Have you heard of Dungeon Crawler Carl?
Yes, by Matt Dinderman.
I haven't read it yet, but like the it's, I mean, clearly it's very like tongue in cheek, and it doesn't, but
Yes.
like, I mean, you could, but the premise does seem a little grim, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and he's also a good example of how things change. Now, I believe he's one of the largest names and most popular that's transcended just the niche itself to where he's known by more mainstream entities. And he did a very different take, which I think is beautiful.
right,
Like, it worked for
right.
him. He took it very tongue in cheek. There's a lot more comedic angle. He's transcended a lot of. Unfortunately, lit RPG for a while had some negative connotations
Hmm.
by also the traditional industry. They kind of
Hmm.
poo-pooed on it.
Yeah, and now I see like agents on Twitter being like, "I'm looking
Yeah,
for a lit
yeah.
RPG," you know?
But let's
Yeah,
be real, because they just the transparency
they,
is that they want the money. That's
yeah,
not
yeah. No,
necessarily,
I know.
I don't know, and there's other implications and considerations of why the lit RPG genre succeeded that I think
Hmm.
still needs to be considered for anyone writing here. That a lot of lit RPG readers are younger. They might not have
Hmm.
the cash, and being indie allows you to be in Kindle Unlimited, which allows for a very good economic model for these readers to get books that they like, which they may not be able to do traditionally for a $14.99 ebook, which I'm not saying that to bash traditional.
Right.
There are economics of publishing, why and where certain genres go. Like urban fantasy blew up in 2015 to 18 indie because people had gone so long without seeing new traditional names, and they still love
Hmm.
the genre, and they're like, where are them? And they all went indie. And that created a
Hmm.
whole new market, and readers got stories they loved.
That, yeah, that is something. Kindle Unlimited. I don't think that there's too many traditional publishers that are taking, for obvious and good reasons, not making books available on Kindle Unlimited. But yeah, I think for like a lit RPG, that's going to limit your readership, which is
Yeah.
something to consider. All right, so I want to give a shout out to a couple different comments here. You don't have to answer this one, but Bogus Kelly's question about
I will endeavor to
AMK.
make that happen. I will be at Dragon Con this year, so
There we go.
uh, I would probably do a 2 a.m. cake run at Dragon Con again. I don't know if the same people last year will be there that I managed to convince to do that, but I am more than happy to go for cake at 2 a.m. to celebrate that launch.
Nice, nice, nice. That's fun. I want to go to Dragon Con. Bo also says you should show off that beautiful special edition you just got.
Oh, yeah, actually, I still have it here by my desk. I was
Nice.
super terrified to take it out of the box. A beautiful
Okay.
artist who goes by the Scripted Letter Co. They are, I believe this is their business that they do. They first tagged me on Instagram with their copy of the first binding that they actually hand painted the paper edges all the way down to match the actual
Wow.
cover. And I didn't realize at first they did this for other books, and it was just so beautiful. And I just thanked them and I shared it, and I was utterly flattered. And I wanted to send them a thank you, which I did. And I sent them some personal stuff, and they surprised me super sweetly by sending me. I gotta unwrap it all because I've kept it exactly the way it was wrapped with their letter, which was super sweet because I'm terrified of like nicking this special edition up. So they sent me a copy of my own book, but
Mm-hmm.
the tweak,
Wow. Wow.
and they hand painted that. It is so marvelous, like the details and actually the very style of painting that Felipe de Barros, my artist, did, down to the actual town structures. Like they matched in everything, and they did that by
That's
hand.
amazing.
It's utterly work of art, and I've been terrified to like move it even. I'm like, I can't bang this copy up. It's still got the bubble wrap and everything in there,
Yeah.
folded with the box. Like I want to display it, and I'm terrified of like damaging it. I'm like, I'll keep
Right.
it in here, and I'll take it out to display if I have to. I won't.
Well, thank you for taking that out and sharing.
Yeah, no problem.
Ariana says, and the keyboard, the special keyboard you got, which I think.
Did. I can't go grab that right now because I actually, so Bo Kelly was super sweet and kind enough as a thank you. And just a gift, he sent me an amazing custom gaming keyboard he built. And I showed it off and did a video earlier, but I actually, he sent it in a case, and I kept that specially with the laptop because I'm actually writing, I promised I would write a story with it, and I am. I'm not, I think this is public now. I'm writing a very special story for Grimdark magazine.
Oh, cool.
For a special edition that they solicited me for, and I'm using Bo's keyboard. So I don't actually have it here with me. I have it at a compartmentalized desk I've been using to write that short story with, or the
Wow.
novelette with. So thank you so much, Bo, and your keyboard is what that's happening on.
That's so cool. I don't know if Bo knows that the story's being written on that, but
He
what a
does
cool
now.
treat. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, he does.
I
Yeah.
did. I did at least say I would do that. I didn't know what story I thought originally I was going to write. As a thank you to my fans, I've been working on some side stories and Tales of Tremaine, which I plan on making free digitally.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And one was finished before he sent the keyboard, and I thought I was going to write the next one that I haven't started yet on it. And then Grimdark came out with this, and I was like, okay, I have a really beautiful novelette for this. I will write this on the keyboard.
So cool. So cool. I love it. Like, I mean, the book community is like just so nice and so yeah, love it. All right, so first binding, of course, is available. The next release is, you said, in the fall, right?
Yes, it's August 13th, I believe, in the States, and then the UK, it's that same Thursday. So for American publishing, they usually release on Tuesdays because of bestseller lists. So for people who aren't aware, if you get pre-orders, they count towards your week 1 sales. But the way pre-orders can sometimes trigger in stores is they can count a day early. So if you release on a Monday, they might count for Sunday, but Sunday is the end of that last previous week. So it cuts off your sales and you can hurt yourself. So for America, they release on Tuesday. So if any sales count early, they count for Monday, which is part of that new sales week. And then the UK, they release on Thursday. And I don't want to say why, because I actually don't know. I'm assuming it's for a similar reason, because I know they have a bestseller week and it just stretches. It might be different, but please don't quote me on that one. But so it's within the same week in both countries for people watching anywhere.
Nice. So Bert, I guess, has 2 questions. One, obviously, book 2 is done if it's going to be published so soon. How is book 3 coming along? He asks.
It's coming along pretty good. So I say that I'm a pantser, but I don't know. I guess it counts as planning too. I write down scenes and beats and tropes or things I want to tackle. And I actually have index cards literally right here. Like, there is an index card board. So you can grab one real quick. Like, I'm going to show the back of it, but I have index cards that are all beats and things that I want to wrap up, discuss, set up, and seed for book 3. And it's sort of my pseudo structure that I'm using. And I'm just doing that right now, hammering it all out before I actually start writing to turn it in next year, because these books are on a two-year schedule in terms of release. So book 1 was 2022. Book 1 was 2022. Book 2 is this year. Book 3 will probably be 2026. Because of the size, and ever since COVID happened, unfortunately, the publishing industry's changed, where paper costs and stuff are gnarly. Publishing lead times have changed, and I'm not the biggest books coming out, but I'm among them. I do believe the biggest still are obviously Sanderson, and there might be a few others, and unfortunately I don't know. I haven't kept up with like word count size anymore, so I can't say. I believe like Wind and Truth is like 491,000 words. Yeah, so he's going to be one of the biggest ever. Yeah. I think the largest is still Tad Williams, where the last book, In Memory of Sorrow, was like 500 something thousand. I think that was that Green Angel Tower. That book was 520,000 words. And it's like one of the largest fantasies ever published.
I can't wrap my head around writing that many words and not finding a place to break it up into 2 books, but well,
it depends on the structure, but yeah.
All right, and last one, silly one. Ariana says that Bert wants to know if you'll grow a mustache.
I suppose what technically qualifies as growing a mustache? Because if I grow all of my facial hair for a period of time and I'm shaving and I shave my mustache last, technically for a short period of time, does it qualify as having a mustache? Because I have done that for kicks and giggles, where I'm shaving and I'll leave just this for like 10 minutes. I'm like, I have a mustache. And I shaved it. Did I grow a mustache? I mean,
you grew a mustache with everything else. Yeah,
with everything else, and then I left the mustache for just long enough to be able to look at it. I think like we're past that era in time where mustaches are in. I'm
man,
sure.
Yeah. I could never rock just the mustache. I don't know.
I don't think it would work for me. It'd bring up a lot of questionable job occupations, or like murderer, or I don't know.
Right. All right, Ronnie. This has been lots of fun. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Where can people find and follow you online?
Right now, best places are definitely going to be my Facebook page, which is just RR Virdi. I have a fan group and a Discord, which people are more than welcome to join. Easiest way to do that would obviously be Twitter, where I'm most active, which is just at RR Virdi. My Instagram is the same. I do have a Blue Sky. I'm not really using it. I think we're in a weird point where social media has fractionalized so much. I don't know where anyone's going anymore and what to do. Like, I posted yesterday a quick thread about the usage of social media, and Facebook is actually still #1 in the world, even though TikTok seems the most popular. Average unique users, it's Facebook. Twitter's like 15. Threads is actually the last. It's the lowest, even if it seems like it's the most popular. It's the last. Number 2 is YouTube. So best place right now, I'm just
Hey,
Twitter is easy,
hey.
and I should probably start honestly YouTubing. And I do have a YouTube, I just haven't done much with it.
Nice. Yeah. I have a writer friend that's on TikTok, and he's doing well there. And I'm like, I gotta do TikTok someday. I don't really want to do TikTok, but I gotta do it.
I don't want to, and I'm not good at social media, but I've had
Yeah.
people tell them I should do what I do on Twitter, which is, as you've seen, like a giant nerd. I just post giant mythological history or literature history and literature threads because I'm a nerd for that, and I know I believe people will enjoy that even if they're not writers, because there's such a beautiful history of the evolution of craft and storytelling and authors inspiring authors and all the way through.
I am here for all the nerdy stuff. So anyway, all right. Thanks again, Ronnie, for being here, and thank you for watching. Again, I put giveaway information into the live chat, so you can look for that link. I put it in a banner at one point during the chat. You guys have to watch and check it out and find the giveaway information. But yeah, appreciate you being here. Appreciate you spending time with us. And if no one's told you today, you're an absolute legend.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.